Picture a blizzard tearing across the Montana plains in the winter of the 1890s. Visibility reduced to almost nothing, snow piling so high across the trail that a stagecoach simply cannot move forward. A lone driver climbs down from the wagon anyway, because the United States government has paid for this mail to arrive, and nothing in the contract mentions an exception for weather that would kill most people who attempted to walk through it. The driver throws the mail sacks over one shoulder and starts walking 10 miles through snow, deep enough to swallow a grown man to the waist, alone in the dark, because the job was simple. The mail gets there, or it doesn't, and for this driver, it always did. That driver was a formerly enslaved black woman in her 60s, named Mary Fields, and for 8 years she ran one of the most dangerous mail routes in the American West without ever missing a single day of delivery. You have likely never heard her real story, only a legend that has grown so distorted over the past century that most of what gets repeated about her on-screen and in popular retellings turns out, on closer inspection of the actual documentary record, to be only partially true. The real Mary Fields is more interesting, more complicated, and in some ways more impressive than the cartoon gunslinger version that Hollywood eventually built around her name. Mary Fields was born into slavery around 1832, most likely in Hickman County, Tennessee, as was tragically common for enslaved people of the period. Almost nothing about her earliest years survives in any written record. Enslaved people were recorded in plantation ledgers as numbers, as property, rarely as names, and Mary herself never knew her actual birth date. Later in life, she simply chose March 15th for herself, a small act of self-authorship in a life that had been denied even the most basic personal documentation at its start. When the Civil War ended and emancipation finally came in 1865, Fields was in her early 30s, facing a country that had just declared her free with absolutely no infrastructure in place to help her build a life from that freedom. She made her way north along the Mississippi River, working as a chambermaid and laundress aboard riverboats, eventually landing in Toledo, Ohio, where she found work at the Ursuline Convent of the Sacred Heart. This is where her story takes its first genuinely strange turn. At the convent, Fields developed an extraordinarily close friendship with a nun named Mother Amadeus, born Dolly Dunn. According to several historical accounts, Mother Amadeus came from the very family that had once enslaved Mary Fields in Tennessee. If accurate, this means one of the most important relationships in Mary Fields' life was with someone connected to the family that had legally owned her as property only years earlier. A detail the popular legend almost never mentions, because it complicates the story in ways that resist easy sentimentality. Whatever the precise nature of that connection, the bond between the two women was real and lasting. When Mother Amadeus was sent to establish a mission in Montana and later fell gravely ill, Fields received word by telegram and immediately left Ohio, boarding a train west to be at her friend's side. She arrived at St. Peter's Mission near Cascade, Montana, in 1885 in her early 50s, and stayed. At the mission, Fields worked as a groundskeeper, hauled freight, did laundry, tended a vegetable garden, repaired buildings, and effectively ran daily operations that kept the entire mission functioning. She was, by every account, capable of doing what 19th century Montana considered men's work, and she did it without apology. She also drank in saloons alongside the men of the town, smoked, swore freely, and carried a temper that eventually led to a physical altercation with a male janitor at the mission, an argument serious enough that both of them reportedly drew guns before anyone intervened. The bishop of the Montana diocese, hearing about Fields' behavior, ordered the convent to dismiss her. She was, in her early 60s, suddenly without steady work, in a frontier town where opportunities for a black woman of her age and reputation were close to non-existent. It is worth pausing on exactly how thin the surviving documentary record is for most of Fields' life before Montana, because this absence is itself a historical fact worth confronting, rather than simply working around. Enslaved people in the antebellum South were, as a matter of routine legal and economic practice, recorded primarily as property, counted in inventories, valued in dollars, occasionally named in a bill of sale. almost never given the kind of continuous documentary attention that would let a later historian reconstruct a childhood, a personality, a set of formative experiences. Mary Fields' early life exists in the historical record, mostly as absence, a gap that her later well-documented decades in Ohio and Montana cannot retroactively fill. This is precisely the kind of gap that legend tends to rush in to fill with invention, because audiences generally prefer a complete story to an honest blank space. The temptation to imagine a dramatic origin, perhaps even a dramatic escape from slavery, for a woman who would later become this, independent and physically capable, is understandable. But the documented record simply does not support inventing those details, and any responsible accounting of her life has to sit with that uncertainty rather than paper over it with satisfying fiction. What happened next is the part of her story that deserves more attention than the gunfights and the legend ever gave it. Mother Amadeus, defying the spirit of the bishop's order, even while technically respecting it, helped Fields secure something the federal government could not take away on a bishop's say-so: a United States Postal Service contract. In 1895, Fields was awarded a Star Route contract, an independent delivery arrangement for mail, traveling the 34-mile round trip between Cascade and St. Peter's Mission. Because federal mail contracts fell under federal jurisdiction, no local church authority had any power to interfere with it. Mary Fields had found a job the bishop himself could not take from her. She became the first African-American woman to hold a Star Route mail contract in the United States, and only the second woman of any race to hold one nationally. This was not a minor accomplishment dressed up by later storytellers for dramatic effect. It is documented, verified federal record, confirmed decisively in 2006, when historian Meanti Metcalf McConnell uncovered original contract documentation and presented it to the United States Postal Service's own archives historian, who formally authenticated Fields' place in postal history. For 8 years, across 2 4-year contract terms, Fields drove that route through every condition the Montana frontier could produce. She carried firearms, typically a revolver tucked beneath her apron and a rifle within reach, specifically to protect both herself and the mail from thieves and, just as seriously, from wolves drawn by the scent of cargo and livestock along an isolated wilderness road. On at least one documented occasion, a pack of wolves surrounded her wagon, and she held them off through the night rather than abandon either her cargo or her horses. The world Mary Fields was navigating in 1880s and 1890s Montana deserves some context, because the difficulty of what she accomplished only becomes clear once you understand exactly how unlikely her position actually was. Montana, in this period, was overwhelmingly white, sparsely populated, and governed by social codes that offered almost no precedent for a black woman operating independently, let alone one entrusted with a federal contract requiring autonomy, reliability, and the legal authority to carry firearms in defense of government property. The vast majority of black Americans living in the West during this era worked in far more constrained roles: domestic service, agricultural labor, or positions within institutions, like the Ursuline mission itself, that offered structure but little independence. Fields occupied none of those constrained categories for long. Even during her years at the mission, witnesses described her taking on responsibilities typically reserved for male staff: hauling freight long distances, repairing structural damage to buildings, managing the physical labor that kept an isolated religious institution functioning in genuinely harsh terrain. When she transitioned to running her own mail route, she was not stepping into independence for the first time. She was simply formalizing, through a federal contract, an independence she had already been quietly building for a decade. This matters because the popular legend tends to frame her toughness as something almost magical or innate, an outsized personality dropped into the frontier, fully formed. The documentary record instead shows something more grounded and, in its own way, more impressive. A woman who built her capability methodically, job by job, skill by skill, across decades, until by the time the Postal Service needed someone reliable enough to run an isolated 34-mile route through wolf country in Montana winters, She was simply the most qualified person available, regardless of what 19th century Montana's social hierarchy might have preferred to believe about who that person should be. If a woman in her 60s holding off a wolf pack alone on a frozen Montana road through an entire night does not impress you, subscribe to Lawless Frontier right now, because the next part of this story is going to completely rearrange what you think you know about her. The legend of Stagecoach Mary that has circulated for more than a century, repeated across documentaries, biographical sketches, and at least half a dozen film and television portrayals, describes a towering, violent figure. A woman well over 6 feet tall, weighing 200 pounds, a notorious gunslinger involved in actual shootouts on the streets of Cascade, feared by bandits who knew better than to test her. This is the version that has been adapted into screenplays, children's books, and television movies, played by actresses including Esther Rolla, Erykah Badu, Zazie Beetz, and Whoopi Goldberg, across various dramatizations spanning decades. Recent biographical research, conducted by McConnell and corroborated through Ursuline Convent Archives in Toledo, pushes back hard against several of these specific claims. According to this more rigorous documentary investigation, Mary Fields was not actually 6 feet tall. She was not known to have participated in literal armed shootouts in the streets. She was strong, undeniably tough, a woman who smoked cigars and wore men's coats and hats against the brutal Montana cold. But the gunfighter mythology that has calcified around her name over the past century appears to be largely later invention, layered onto a real woman whose actual documented accomplishments were already extraordinary enough without embellishment. Even her famous nickname carries a buried inaccuracy. Local Montana historians are emphatic on this point. Mary Fields never actually drove a stagecoach. Her Star Route contract had her driving horses and a wagon, sometimes specifically a team and a mule named Moses, across rugged terrain that a true stagecoach designed for established roads rather than wilderness trails would never have survived. The nickname stuck anyway, romantic and alliterative, and the legend simply absorbed the inaccuracy along with everything else. This pattern, where a remarkable real story gets quietly inflated into an even more dramatic invented one, deserves a moment of honest reflection, because it is not unique to Mary Fields. Historians who study how Black pioneers of the American West have been remembered point to a recurring trope: extraordinary documented achievement by Black Americans in frontier settings often gets re-narrated, decades or a century later, into something more cartoonish, more superhuman, more violent than the documented reality, almost as if quiet, sustained competence and reliability were considered insufficiently dramatic on their own to anchor a legend. The real Mary Fields did not need invented gunfights. She needed only to be exactly what she actually was: the first Black woman trusted by the federal government with an isolated, dangerous mail route, who performed that job for 8 years without a single missed day, defended by nothing more mythical than a revolver, a rifle, and an apparently genuine willingness to stand her ground against wolves in a blizzard. The string of actresses who have portrayed Mary Fields across film and television since the 1970s: Esther Rolla, Dawn Lewis, Kimberly Elise, Erykah Badu, Zazie Beetz, Whoopi Goldberg, each working from scripts that leaned into the gunslinging legend rather than the more carefully documented historical record, says something about the entertainment industry's priorities that extends well beyond this single story. A studio pitching a Western generally wants gunfights, towering physical presence, cinematic confrontation. A federal mail contractor who succeeded primarily through reliability, physical endurance, and an apparently genuine generosity toward people who could not pay their bills does not, on paper, sound like guaranteed box office. So the story got adjusted repeatedly across decades of retellings until the adjustment itself became the version most audiences now consider true. What the embellished legend also tends to flatten is Fields' generosity, which the documentary record describes consistently and specifically. Before securing her postal contract, Fields attempted to run an eatery in Cascade. It failed within roughly 10 months, and multiple independent sources agree on the specific reason: she could not stop feeding people who had no money to pay her. This detail appears across nearly every serious biographical account of her life, which suggests it reflects something genuinely central to who she was, rather than sentimental invention. The voter registration discovery McConnell uncovered alongside the mail contract documentation deserves particular attention, because it adds a dimension to Fields' story that the gunslinger legend never bothered to include at all. Historical records confirm that Mary Fields was the first African American to register to vote in Cascade, Montana, a detail with genuine significance, given how aggressively voting rights for Black Americans, and especially Black women, were restricted and contested throughout this period of American history, decades before the 19th Amendment would even grant women nationally the right to vote at all. This single fact reframes how we should understand her place in Cascade's community. She was not merely tolerated as a colorful local eccentric, the role the legend often reduces her to. She was, by documented action, asserting a form of civic participation that remained genuinely dangerous and contested for Black Americans across most of the country during these exact years, in towns and states where doing so could carry serious personal risk. That she did this in rural Montana, in a community where she was one of vanishingly few Black residents, says something about both her own resolve and, notably, about a town that appears to have extended her a degree of civic inclusion that was far from universal in this period of American history. After retiring from her postal route in 1903 in her early 70s, Fields opened a laundry business and took on babysitting work for local children, charging $1.50 a day. Children in Cascade reportedly adored her, despite, or perhaps partly because of, her rough exterior and unconventional manner. When Montana law prohibited women from entering saloons, the mayor of Cascade granted Mary Fields a specific personal exception, allowing her to keep drinking with the men of the town, as she always had. The town declared her birthday an unofficial local holiday and closed the school in observance. When fire destroyed part of her home in 1912, the townspeople of Cascade rebuilt it for her. In 1914, 2 boys found her lying in the snow at the edge of town. She died shortly afterward of liver failure, and the entire town of Cascade attended her funeral. In 1959, the actor Gary Cooper, himself a Montana native who had grown up hearing stories about her, wrote a tribute published in Ebony magazine that captured something the later, more sensationalized legend would eventually obscure rather than illuminate. Born a slave somewhere in Tennessee, he wrote, Mary lived to become one of the freest souls ever to draw a breath, or a 38. That sentence does not require an invented gunfight to land with weight. It carries the actual documented arc of her life, property turned federal contractor, a woman the law itself had once defined as someone else's possession, who later became someone the United States government trusted, unsupervised, with the mail of an entire region, armed only with her own competence and whatever she happened to be carrying under her apron that day. The legend made her taller, more violent, and more cinematic than the record supports. The truth made her something arguably rarer on the American frontier. A formerly enslaved Black woman in her 60s who simply outworked, outlasted, and outstubborned every obstacle. Montana's wilderness and Montana's prejudice put in front of her, one snow-covered mile at a time, for 8 unbroken years. If you want the real history behind the legends of the American frontier, subscribe to Lawless Frontier, because next week we go somewhere even darker,